James Parker stepped off the subway, the rhythmic hum of the train fading behind him as he emerged onto the dimly lit city street. It was late, almost 10 p.m., and the air carried a biting chill that cut through his thin jacket. Winter was approaching fast, and he made a mental note to dig out his heavier coat before the week was over. His day had been long, endless meetings, phone calls, and deadlines. As a journalist for the Tribune, he was used to the grind, but tonight, fatigue pressed down on him harder than usual. He just wanted to get home, kick off his shoes, and maybe pour himself a glass of whiskey before collapsing onto the couch. The walk from the station to his apartment complex was only a few blocks, but the streets were unusually quiet for this time of night. The city never truly slept, but tonight it felt like it was holding its breath. James barely noticed. He was too preoccupied with the vibrating phone in his pocket, a message from his editor reminding him about a piece he had to finalize in the morning. He sighed and typed out a quick response, assuring her he'd handle it first thing. As he turned onto his street, his mind already halfway home, he saw something that made him slow his pace. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off the buildings, bouncing across the wet pavement like ghostly beacons. Police cars, at least 2, maybe 3, were parked haphazardly in front of his apartment complex. A few officers stood near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones. Something had happened. James felt a flicker of unease. His building wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. Occasionally there were noise complaints, an argument that got out of hand, or a minor theft in the lobby, but nothing that warranted this level of police presence. He quickened his pace, his mind racing with possibilities. Was there a break-in, a fight, or something worse? Just as he reached the front steps, someone grabbed his wrist. He turned sharply, startled, and found himself face to face with Miss Thompson, his elderly neighbor from 2 doors down. She was in her 70s, a kind but no-nonsense woman who had lived in the building for over 30 years. Normally, she carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, but tonight her face was pale, her hand trembling slightly as she held on to him. "James," she whispered, her voice urgent but low, as if she was afraid of being overheard, "don't go inside." He blinked, confused. What? Why? She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting between the officers and the building's entrance before returning to him. "Something happened in your apartment." His stomach dropped. "My apartment?" She nodded. "I heard noises earlier, loud noises. I thought maybe it was just the television, but then there was a crash, and then nothing. I was going to check on you, but when I stepped into the hallway, I saw the door to your place was open." James swallowed, a cold sensation creeping up his spine. "Open? But I locked it this morning." "I know you did," she said. "That's why I called the police. When they arrived, they told me to stay out of the way, but James—" She hesitated, gripping his wrist tighter. "The way they looked when they came back out. Something's wrong." His pulse quickened. He turned toward the entrance, but Miss Thompson pulled him back. "Don't," she pleaded. "Not yet. Let them come to you." James was about to protest when one of the officers near the door spotted him. The man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with sharp eyes, stepped forward. His gaze was assessing, cautious. "Are you James Parker?" he asked. James nodded. "Yeah, this is my apartment." "What the hell is going on?" The officer glanced at Miss Thompson before returning his attention to James. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions. Where have you been for the last several hours?" James frowned. "I was at work all day. I left my apartment around 8 this morning, took the subway to the office, and I've been there ever since. I just got back." The officer exchanged a look with his colleague. Something in his expression made James's skin prickle. "Sir, do you live alone?" "Yes." "Does anyone else have a key to your apartment?" James shook his head. "Not that I know of. I mean, maybe the landlord has a copy, but no one else." The officer exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. "All right, I need you to come inside with me. But before we go in, I want to prepare you. There's been a disturbance in your unit." James's chest tightened. What kind of disturbance? The officer hesitated, then motioned for him to follow. Ms. Thompson gave his wrist one last squeeze before letting him go. James forced himself to move, his legs stiff as he climbed the steps. Inside, the lobby was quiet. The security guard, an older man named Luis, was nowhere to be seen. The usual hum of the television in the corner was absent. The elevator doors stood open, an officer stationed beside them. James followed the lead officer to the second floor, his heart pounding harder with each step. When they reached his apartment, he saw the door standing ajar, just as Miss Thompson had described. The lock was intact, no signs of forced entry. One of the officers inside glanced up as they entered, giving James a brief, unreadable look before stepping aside. Then James saw it. His living room was a wreck. His coffee table had been overturned, the contents of his bookshelves scattered across the floor. The couch cushions had been slashed open, stuffing spilling out like exposed wounds. Papers, his notes, his documents, were strewn everywhere. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Near the entrance to the kitchen, just a few feet away, there was a dark stain on the floor, a deep, almost black pool of something thick and congealed. Blood. James felt his breath hitch. He took a step forward, but the officer beside him put a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "You said you were at work all day?" the officer asked again, his voice carefully measured. "Yes," James said, his voice hoarse. "I swear, I have no idea what the hell is this?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded toward the kitchen counter. James followed his gaze. And then he saw it. A note, written in smudged red letters. "You weren't supposed to be here." James felt a cold sweat break out along his spine. He had walked into crime scenes before, covered violent stories for the paper, but never had he stood in the center of one. Never had his own home become the site of something so terrifying. He turned back to the officer, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell happened here? James stood frozen at the threshold of his own apartment, his heart pounding against his ribs. The air inside felt different, thick, stale, heavy with something unspoken. He could smell it now, the faint metallic tang in the air, the unmistakable scent of blood. The realization sent a wave of nausea rolling through him, but he forced himself to stay upright, to keep breathing. The officer, the one who had stopped him before, spoke again, his voice firm but calm. "Mr. Parker, I need you to step back for a moment." James barely registered the words. His eyes were locked onto the smeared note on the counter, the message written in what he now knew wasn't ink. "You weren't supposed to be here." The letters were uneven, hurried, as if written by a shaking hand. The words clawed at his brain, each syllable twisting into something dark and incomprehensible. "Mr. Parker," the officer repeated, more forcefully this time. James blinked, finally turning his attention back to the man standing beside him. What the hell is going on?" His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, rough and strained. The officer sighed, exchanging a look with his colleague who stood near the entrance, radio clipped to his shoulder. "We're trying to determine that right now. You said you locked the door when you left this morning?" "Yes," James said immediately. "I always do." "And no one else has a key?" "Not that I know of," James repeated, then frowned. "Wait, my landlord might have a copy. But I don't know why he would have been here. He usually gives notice before coming in for anything." The officer made a note of that, but didn't look convinced. "We didn't find any signs of forced entry. That means whoever did this either had a key or was let in." James swallowed, his throat dry. "But I don't know anyone who would do this. I don't have enemies. He gestured to the wreckage around him. "This doesn't make any sense." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he motioned toward the kitchen. "We're still processing the scene, but we need to ask, do you recognize that?" James hesitated, his stomach twisting as he forced himself to step closer. The blood, God, there was so much of it, was pooled on the kitchen tiles, partially dried, the edges flaking where it had begun to set. But what caught his eye was something lying in the middle of it. A knife. His knife. The one from his own kitchen set. It was covered in blood, the handle sticky, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. James shook his head, his breath coming faster. "That's mine. That knife. It's from my kitchen." He looked up, his pulse hammering. "What the hell is this? Is someone hurt? Did someone—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of it sat on his chest like a stone. The officer's jaw tightened. "There's no body." The word sent a chill through James. "What?" "We found blood, signs of a struggle, but no body. Whoever was hurt here—" The officer gestured around them. "They're gone." James felt dizzy. He reached for the counter, gripping the edge tightly. "So you don't know who it was?" "We're working on identifying the blood," the officer said. "But as of now, we don't know whose it is." James exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. His thoughts were spinning, a chaotic blur of confusion and fear. "And the note?" He pointed at the smeared words on the counter. "What the hell does that mean?" The officer studied it for a long moment before speaking. "Could be a warning, could be a threat, or maybe just someone trying to mislead us." James felt frustration bubble up beneath his fear. This isn't just some random break-in. Someone came here, wrecked my place, bled all over my floor, and then left me a message? Why? Why my apartment? "That's what we're trying to find out," the officer said evenly. "For now, we need to go over everything carefully. We'll be collecting evidence, dusting for prints, and reviewing any available security footage." James' head snapped up. "Wait. Security footage. There are cameras in the lobby, right?" The officer nodded. "Yes. We're already in the process of obtaining the footage from the building security system." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe that would give them answers. Maybe they'd see whoever did this. Just then, another officer entered the apartment, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was something James recognized immediately: his spare key. "Found this just outside the door," the officer said. "No prints on it, but it looks like it was dropped in a hurry." James felt a fresh wave of unease wash over him. His spare key had been inside his apartment. He kept it in a drawer just in case. Someone had used it to get in. The lead officer studied James closely. "Mr. Parker, is there anyone at all, who might have had access to this key?" James racked his brain. "No. I don't lend out my keys. No friends, no family who stay over." He hesitated. "Unless—" The officer's expression sharpened. "Unless what?" James exhaled. "A few weeks ago, my landlord sent a maintenance guy to fix a plumbing issue. I wasn't home, so they used the spare key to get in, but they were supposed to put it back in the drawer." The officer nodded. "We'll follow up with the landlord. In the meantime, we need to process your statement at the station." James hesitated. Am I a suspect?" The officer's expression remained unreadable. "Right now, we're treating you as a witness, but given that this happened in your apartment, we need to cover all angles." James let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Great." As the officers continued their work, James glanced back at the note one last time. He didn't know who had written it, didn't know why his home had been turned into a crime scene. But one thing was certain: whoever had been in his apartment hadn't been a stranger to the place. And that terrified him more than anything. James sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the police station, his fingers laced together, knuckles white from how tightly he was gripping his own hands. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the faint hum of overhead fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears. Across from him, Detective Alan Reeves studied him with a calm, assessing gaze. The man looked to be in his late 40s, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a demeanor that suggested he had seen far too many cases like this. cases where things didn't add up. James had been here for over an hour, going through every detail he could remember. He had told them about his morning routine, his locked door, his landlord's maintenance worker from weeks ago, the spare key that had been used. He had explained over and over that he had been at work the entire day, that he had only come home to find the mess waiting for him. Reeves leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers against the case file in front of him. "Let's go over this one more time, James. You're telling me you have no idea who could have done this?" James exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling beneath his exhaustion. "No, Detective, I don't. I wish I did. Believe me, I'd love to know who broke into my place, wrecked my apartment, and left a pool of blood in my kitchen. But I don't." Reeves nodded slowly, then flipped open the file, revealing printed photos, crime scene images taken from his apartment. James swallowed hard as he forced himself to look. The overturned furniture, the scattered papers, the blood, and the note. "You weren't supposed to be here," Reeves read aloud, his voice quiet but firm. He studied James carefully. "What do you think that means?" James shook his head. "I don't know. You have no theories, no enemies, no personal disputes?" James let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his face. "I'm a journalist, Detective. Sure, I've written a few stories that might have pissed some people off, but nothing serious. Nothing that would lead to this." He gestured vaguely at the photos. Reeves didn't break eye contact. "What kind of stories?" James hesitated. "Crime, mostly. Corruption. Some investigative pieces on fraud, real estate scams, that kind of thing." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Anything recent that might have struck a nerve?" James thought back. His latest piece had been about city infrastructure failures, a boring but necessary article about budget mismanagement. Before that, he had written an exposé on a fraudulent charity organization, but it had only resulted in some angry emails, nothing serious. But then, there was... He sat up straighter. "A couple of months ago, I wrote something about a local businessman," he said slowly. "Daniel Kern. He owns a few nightclubs, some real estate developments, but there were rumors that he had other businesses too, shady ones. I dug into it, but I couldn't prove anything illegal. Still, the article painted him in a bad light. He wasn't happy about it." Reeves made a note. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," James admitted. "Just a few 'you'll regret this' kind of comments, but nothing more." The detective nodded but didn't look convinced. A knock on the door interrupted them. Another officer leaned in and handed Reeves a folder. "Blood analysis just came in." Reeves took it, flipping through the pages. His expression didn't change, but James saw the subtle shift in his eyes, the way they sharpened slightly. "What?" James asked, pulse quickening. Reeves set the folder down and folded his hands. "The blood in your apartment belongs to a man named Brian Ellis. Do you know that name?" James frowned, thinking. "No." "Who is he?" Reeves tilted his head. "Ellis has a record, small-time criminal, mostly theft, some assault charges. Recently, though, he's been associated with a few bigger names. Names like Daniel Kern." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Wait, are you saying this guy worked for Kern?" "Possibly," Reeves said. "We're still looking into it. But if he was in your apartment and left that much blood behind, one of two things happened. Either he was attacked there, or he attacked someone else and got hurt in the process." James shook his head, trying to process it. "But why my apartment? I don't even know him." "That's what we need to figure out," Reeves said. "Tell me, did you notice anything missing from your place? Anything stolen?" James thought about it. His laptop had still been there, his TV, his valuables. Everything seemed accounted for, except for the mess. "No, I don't think so." Reeves exhaled. "That's interesting, isn't it? Because if this were just a break-in gone wrong, you'd expect something to be missing. But nothing was." which makes me think that your apartment wasn't just some random target. Ellis, or whoever else was with him, was looking for something specific. James felt a growing knot of unease in his stomach. But I don't have anything. Nothing valuable, nothing worth breaking in for. Maybe you don't, Reeves said. But what if someone thought you did? James ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. This still doesn't make sense. Even if Ellis was there looking for something, why leave a note like that? You weren't supposed to be here. It almost sounds like they were expecting someone else. Reeves leaned back in his chair, considering. Or maybe they were expecting you to be gone longer. James's breath caught. What if they thought they had more time? Reeves continued. If you came home earlier than they expected, maybe they panicked. Maybe something went wrong. James swallowed hard. So what now? We find Ellis, Reeves said simply. He's injured, which means he'll either seek medical help or go into hiding. Either way, we'll track him down. James exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. And in the meantime? Reeves gave him a steady look. I'd suggest you stay somewhere else for a while. Whoever was in your apartment, Ellis or someone else, may not be done yet. James nodded slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. This wasn't just some random burglary. Someone had been in his home for a reason. Someone had bled all over his kitchen floor and left a message meant for him. And whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be caught. James didn't sleep that night. After leaving the police station, he checked into a small hotel across town, one of those nondescript places where no one asked questions. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The bed was too stiff, and the hum of the air conditioning unit filled the silence. But none of that mattered. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. Brian Ellis. The name meant nothing to him, but it was now entangled with his life in a way he didn't understand. The police believed Ellis had been in his apartment. The blood proved that. But what had happened? Had Ellis been the intruder, or had he been running from someone? And the note? You weren't supposed to be here. Who had written it, and for whom? His mind kept circling back to Daniel Kern, the businessman with a reputation for shady dealings. James had written about him, exposed the underbelly of his so-called legitimate empire. Had Kern retaliated? Had he sent Ellis to intimidate him, to ransack his home? But if that were the case, why the blood? Why the chaos? It didn't add up. By morning, James was running on nothing but caffeine and nerves. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. A call from Detective Reeves. James, Reeves said as soon as he answered. We found Ellis. James sat up. Where? Hospital. He showed up at a clinic late last night with a stab wound in his side. Didn't use his real name, but the staff flagged him when they saw the wound looked suspicious. By the time officers got there, he was gone. But we have security footage from the clinic. James gripped the phone tighter. And? Reeves hesitated. He wasn't alone. Someone brought him in. James's stomach twisted. Who? We're still trying to ID him. Tall guy, hooded sweatshirt, kept his head down. He paid for Ellis's treatment in cash and then got him out of there before we could get to him. But here's the thing. Before they left, a nurse overheard Ellis say something. James felt his pulse quicken. What did he say? Reeves sighed. He said, I couldn't find it. He didn't have it. James went cold. What does that mean? You tell me, Reeves said. What could Ellis have been looking for in your apartment? I don't know, James said, frustration creeping into his voice. I have nothing worth stealing, nothing related to Kern or Ellis or any of this. But someone clearly thought I did. Reeves was silent for a moment. Then, James, I need you to think. Have you come into possession of anything unusual lately? Anything someone might believe is valuable? A document, a file, a piece of evidence? Anything. James opened his mouth to say no, but then he froze. A memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, an envelope had arrived at his office, no return address. Inside had been a single USB drive wrapped in a note that simply read, "For your next story." At the time, James had been buried under deadlines. He had tossed the envelope into his desk drawer, meaning to look at it later, but had forgotten about it entirely. It had been such a small, insignificant thing at the time. But now— "James?" Reeves prompted. James's throat was dry. There's something. A USB drive. It was sent to me anonymously." Reeves' tone sharpened. "And what's on it?" "I don't know," James admitted. "I never checked." A beat of silence. Then, "Where is it now?" James's heart was pounding. "At my office, in my desk." "Listen to me," Reeves said, his voice suddenly urgent. "You need to get it, now. If this is what Ellis and whoever he's working for were looking for, then they might try again." James didn't need to be told twice. He was already grabbing his jacket, shoving his phone into his pocket. "I'll call you when I have it." "Be careful, James," Reeves said before hanging up. James made it to his office in record time. The Tribune's newsroom was nearly empty this early in the morning, just a few bleary-eyed journalists nursing coffee cups, typing away at their desks. No one paid him much attention as he hurried to his desk, unlocking the bottom drawer where he had stashed the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled it out. The USB drive was still inside, small and unassuming. He grabbed his laptop, plugged it in, and opened the only file it contained: a video. James clicked play. Grainy security footage filled the screen, a dimly lit parking garage. A black sedan pulled into view. A man stepped out. James recognized him instantly. Daniel Kern. He was speaking to someone just out of frame. A moment later, the camera caught a glimpse of the second man, Ryan Ellis. The footage was poor quality, but the audio was clear. "You screwed up." Kern's voice came through the speakers. "I paid you to handle this." "I did," Ellis protested, "but the cops showed up too fast. Someone tipped them off." Kern's expression darkened. "Then we have a problem, because now Parker knows something's up, and if he finds out what's really going on— Oh!" He stopped mid-sentence, looking straight into the camera as if suddenly aware of it. The video cut out. James sat back, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about a robbery. Kern had ordered something done, something involving him, and Ellis had been the one sent to execute it. James barely had time to process before his phone rang. Reeves. "James, get out of the office, now." James' blood ran cold. "We just traced the car that picked up Ellis from the clinic. It was registered to one of Kern's businesses. We think they know you have the USB. You need to leave." A noise from the newsroom made James turn. A man had just walked in, tall, hooded sweatshirt. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on James. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed the USB, shoved his laptop into his bag, and bolted. The man moved fast, but James was faster. He pushed past desks, knocking over a stack of papers as he sprinted for the stairwell. Behind him, he heard hurried footsteps, a sharp curse. He took the stairs 2 at a time, heart hammering, adrenaline surging. Bursting out onto the street, he barely had time to catch his breath before a black SUV screeched around the corner. The passenger window rolled down. A gun. James dove behind a parked car as a shot rang out. Pedestrians screamed. Tires screeched. Then another sound. Police sirens. The SUV peeled away just as unmarked police cars came speeding toward the scene. James looked up to see Reeves stepping out of the nearest vehicle, gun drawn. "You okay?" Reeves asked. James nodded, still breathless. "I have it," he said, holding up the USB. Reeves exhaled in relief. "Good. Because this just became our best evidence." In the days that followed, the footage was turned over to the authorities. The case against Kern exploded. Evidence of money laundering, illegal operations, even suspected disappearances tied back to him. The footage on the USB had been the missing link. Brian Ellis was found a week later, dead. James knew he had come dangerously close to being another loose end, but for now, he was safe. One thing was certain. He wasn't supposed to be home that night, and that fact alone had saved his life.